Joined by Mail Online reporter Lettis Bromovsky and the Eyes global affairs correspondent Molly Blackall. So welcome back to both of you. In the last hour, we went through a pretty comprehensive list of tariff stories which are dominating the papers, but we thought we'd take a look around at some of the other issues that have been perhaps pushed off the front pages but still big news. Molly, you've picked out on the front of the Telegraph, and obviously it expands inside because it's very small on the front, about the latest on Trump's attempts to get peace in Ukraine. So what's this latest line they have here?
So it's another statement from the White House, this time basically saying we're not going to be doing this forever with you. The door won't always be open for these talks. Whether that's actually true, and they do have a sort of timeline in mind, or whether this is a ploy to kind of force Putin back to the negotiating table, I'm not sure. I would assume it's the latter. Donald Trump obviously made a big promise that he was going to solve the war in Ukraine. I think he actually promised to do so on day one. We're obviously quite a few days past that, and he hasn't yet managed to get a deal. Donald Trump is a huge sort of deal maker, and the feeling in Washington is that he also really wants the Nobel Peace Prize. So he's really pushing hard to get a deal over the line, but Putin isn't really playing ball, so we haven't seen him engaging sort of substantially in these talks. He rejected a full ceasefire and only offered a kind of partial deal around the Black Sea, which isn't really making any meaningful moves. And to be honest, Russia doesn't really have that much incentive to sort of bring a ceasefire about. They've been making some advances on the battlefield, and they want to keep that going as long as possible. But also their economy, despite all the sanctions from European countries, including the UK, don't really seem to be damaging them that substantially. Their economy is very heavily geared to the defence industry, so it sort of can keep going. So I think this is basically a statement expressing frustration at the talks and trying to sort of force Putin to engage.
Well, yes, and we've seen very public examples of President Trump putting pressure on President Zelensky, but we've not seen so much that pressure being brought to bear on President Putin. Obviously, this frustration now being expressed, but the question is, I guess, what tools he might have to ratchet up the pressure further.
Exactly, and as you're saying, there isn't really an incentive here for Putin to come to the table. He's not going to engage in a negotiation where he has to give back the land to Ukraine or to Zelensky. That isn't something that he'll be willing to negotiate over. Another thing that we've seen is, with these tariffs, which we've all been talking about so much, Russia seems to be the only country in the entire world that has come out unscathed. Now, when we went to the US Department to see what their statement was on this, they said, oh, on the sanctions, we don't trade with Russia. That's not true. As of last year, there was $3 billion in trade that went on between the US and Russia. So there is trade there. So for some unknown reason, Russia really does seem to be the only country in the world that has come out unscathed in these tariff wars.
Yeah, so that's another one to keep an eye on that's going on in the background. You realise that Donald Trump is making so many statements on so many issues that occupies your attention. You forget about some of the others.
It's hard to keep up, isn't it?
Absolutely. Lettis, take us to the Mail's front page. They lead on a Prince Andrew story, like the Telegraph does as well. So talk us through it.
Yeah, so this is a sort of development on a story that we've already heard about, and it's essentially saying that the king is now actually involved in this Chinese spy scandal. So a man called Dominic Hampshire, who was a senior aide to Prince Andrew, has said in his recent witness statement that the Duke himself, Dominic, and the King actually had two meetings between November 2023 and May 2024. And in these meetings, which were meant to be about, what it says here is, what the Duke can do moving forward in ways that is acceptable to His Majesty. So this was in the wake of the Jeffrey Epstein and Prince Andrew scandal, where their relationship caused a lot of issues in the press and further forward. But it's basically what they discussed at that meeting. Now, Dominic has said that they discussed the Eurasia Fund. Now, the Eurasia Fund has strong links with this Chinese spy called Yang Tengbo.
Alleged Chinese spy, we should say. He denies the allegations.
Of course, he denies, and it hasn't actually been taken to a court of law. MI5 have banned him from the UK for the past 2 years because of national security. As you say, he denies these allegations. And so really the king is being once again drawn into another scandal surrounding his brother, Prince Andrew. I think the main thing we should take away from this is it raises questions about the vetting process of who's getting to see the royal family and why he's been allowed to engage in these sort of activities with the royal family when Dominic allegedly knew from 2021 that there were security concerns around Yang, the alleged spy.
Which is probably a good opportunity for me to now read some of the statements that have come out about this. Buckingham Palace have put out a statement responding to the story saying, while His Majesty met with the Duke and his advisor to hear outline proposals for independent funding over the past year, the individual known as H6 was not mentioned at any time or in any way as part of these discussions. And Dominic Hampshire himself, as you say, Prince Andrew's former aide, has also given a statement after these documents were released. He has said, the Palace was kept informed of all my commercial endeavours on behalf of the Duke of York, and full disclosure of all communications with Mr Yang, the Hampton Group and China was offered to both Buckingham Palace and the intelligence services. And he goes on to say, for the record, as soon as the Duke of York was advised to cease all contact with Mr Yang, he fully complied. He did not receive a penny in funding or support, directly or indirectly, from any Chinese individual or entity. And apologies, those are so long, but it's worth getting, their point of view across. Molly, I'm going to move us on if that's OK, just because we want to try and get a few more stories in. But as we say, we went into detail on the first paper review, but there are some interesting examples cropping up in the papers beyond that kind of big issue of whether to retaliate or not, and different countries are making different decisions. Take us to the front of the Financial Times, because they're looking at beer.
They are looking at beer, an issue close to many Brits' hearts, I think it's fair to say. So this is about a tariff on beer, which could cost, according to this report, 100,000 jobs in Europe. So really bad news on that front. It's basically also saying, which I find really interesting, that this will also inflict a financial hit on American importers of European beer because of the knock-on effect on pricing. So actually it will end up potentially being passed on to consumers and businesses within the US itself, which is the opposite of what Donald Trump is aiming for here. As you say, it's just another example of the myriad of ways that these tariffs are going to affect businesses and consumers all around the world. I mean, there's very few countries which are untouched by this. But there's still a bit of confusion on how some of these will actually work in practice. So there's a line in this story which says brewers are confused as to whether the tariff applies to all beer or only products imported within cans. There's a real lack of clarity.
Because the cans are made of aluminium, which is hit by a
all
global...
very confusing. But I think it adds to this confusion around this and this feeling that some of these tariffs might be a little bit rushed. So one of my favourite stories around this is that penguins have come under the Tariff Act. So there's two Antarctic outposts which have been had tariffs slapped upon them, despite having no humans arrive there for nearly a decade. And the Australian Trade Minister sort of linked it back to this. It's close to Australia, this place. And he said, poor old penguins, I don't know what they ever did to Trump. But he made a more serious point that it does indicate there are potentially some rushing going on here and maybe some confusion because he thinks the penguins won must be a mistake. So it sounds like confusion really across the board and a lack of clarity needed, I think, on the impact of some of these tariffs.
Yeah, and certainly a lot of leaders and scratching their heads now, working out what the next steps might be and what their next steps should be. Anyway, Molly and Lettuce, for the moment, we're out of time, but I'll see you again in the next hour. More then. Thank you.
We are